Hi, how are you? It's good to see
Fine,
you.
thank you. How are you? Are you in Lanet, Nakuru, or Nairobi? Or
I
some
am
other
in
part of the
Malindi.
planet?
I am in Malindi at the
You're in
coast of,
Nairobi?
in Malindi.
Nairobi.
Yes,
Some people have a good life.
I am right at the coast in the warmth.
Very good.
As for those in Nairobi, we envy that. You know, that is just, the cold here is unbearable, man.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, over to you, Salome. We can start the program.
Salome, you're on mute. You're on mute. Salome, kindly unmute, please.
Hi.
Hello.
Are you getting me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar session on tracking progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, launch of Afrobarometer East African SDG Scorecards. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs are expected to drive nation and the global development agendas for the next decade, and the area a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy the peace and the prosperity by 2030. 6 years down the line, how close is Africa to achieving the SDGs? The 17 SDGs are linked to 169 targets to be tracked by a proposed 230 individuals indicators. And there are already a lot of important indicators and scorecards being used to track progress. Afrobarometer launched the SDG scorecard in May, after which we began a series of regional webinars to discuss the country scorecards in detail. This scorecard provides a unique perspective for the measurement of progress in Africa, the views of ordinary African citizens who are in fact the intended beneficiaries of SDGs. This is the third edition of the regional webinars, and we will be throwing the spotlight on Sudan, 5 East Africa countries, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. My name's Salome Kitomari. I'm a senior journalist and assistant news editor for Nipashe in Tanzania. So I would like to welcome our panelists for today, who are Abel Oyuke, Afrobarometer East Africa Project Manager from Kenya. Can you say hello to members?
Hello,
Abel?
everyone. Hello, everyone. Please welcome to our discussion today.
Welcome. Our second is Crystal Simeon, Director of NAWI AFREM Macroeconomic Collective from Kenya. Welcome, Crystal. And the third one is Al Kags, co-founder of and the executive director of the Open Institutes from Kenya also. Welcome. And the last one is Aidan Eakuze, executive director of Twaweza from Tanzania, where I am. Welcome, Aidan. Before starting our panel discussion, I will take you through the house rules just for 1 minute. This session is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube and on Facebook. And social media hashtag for this conversation are #voices. V is their capital letter, voices. Africa is A, capital letter. So is Voices Africa, hashtag Voices Africa, and #SDGs. So please retweet, put in on your social media and retweet the message as much as you can, tag as much as you can. Also, participants can use question and answer features to type in their questions. So if you have any question, please put it in chat box and then I will read the question to our panelists. We'll answer those questions. So I welcome all of you to this session, and we hope we'll get all the information that we need. So I would like to call on Abel Oyuke to present the Afrobarometer SDG scorecard. You have 20 minutes. Welcome, Abel.
Thank you, Salome. Thank you so much. Candid introduction. I want to take this opportunity to welcome everybody to this discussion, and more importantly, to the team of panelists with whom we are going to carry this discussion forward. In the interest of time, I'll just move straight away. I think, as Salome has indicated, we are all aware that in the year 2015, the United Nations adopted the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and also ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by the year 2030. Now, the SDGs are expected to drive national and global agendas in order to improve our planet, but also to make sure that we end poverty and people also enjoy kind of lives that they have. We know for sure that this process of tracking the progress on these SDGs is not easy. It's a challenging task. But we also know that no matter how difficult it is, it's essential, it's fundamental. We need to do it so that we can actually inform the policy decisions that we make in terms of governing our countries. Out there, many organizations, many governments, and the UN itself has put out several indicators and scorecards that have been used to track these SDGs. As Afrobarometer, our unique contribution in this respect is to provide a perspective that brings into focus the evaluations, the experiences of the ordinary citizen. That is a perspective that has been missing in many of the indicators that are out there. This is the uniqueness that we provide as an Afrobarometer. The SDG scorecards that we have developed reflect on these experiences and evaluations of the respective countries where we carry out our surveys. They can actually be compared to the UN tracking indicators that are already out there. And we know that meeting these particular targets means improving people's lives. It means that we are making decisions that seek to improve our planet, but also enhance the life of the people. This is why we find it critical that in assessing these SDGs, it would be critical, it would be imperative that we bring in the focus of the people's perspective. This is why we say the assessments that we carry out as Afrobarometer must actually involve this evaluation by the people themselves, because it is these very people that we seek to impact their lives. In what we have before us are actually the SDGs. And Afrobarometer, out of the 17 SDGs that we have, Afrobarometer has data that speaks candidly to 12 of those SDGs, as we're going to see. From the set of repeated surveys that we've done in over 39 countries in Africa, we have tracked 12, as you can see from the screen. Our signature topic as Afrobarometer is on democracy and governance, which speaks directly to SDG 16 of the United Nations. But we also have data from what we have generated over the years. We also have data that speaks to issues around poverty, health, education, energy supply, water and sanitation, infrastructure, gender and equality, among many other topics that relate to the SDGs. As we speak now, Afrobarometer has actually undertaken 7 rounds of survey between 1999 to the year 2018. Currently, we have our what we call our round 8, the phase 8 surveys that are just about to be concluded, our last country now being Mozambique. And by the conclusion of the last country in Mozambique, we shall have covered 34 African countries. And in just a month or so, probably August, we will be beginning our round 9 set of surveys. I think I need to highlight also that the results that we have as Afrobarometer can actually be disaggregated by several socioeconomic, demographic characteristics, including gender, age, education, economic status, among others. It is therefore rich data that can be disaggregated to suit the kind of analysis that we intend to do for ourselves. Here, what we see are just a few examples of how Afrobarometer indicators can contribute to measuring progress towards the SDGs. For goal 16, for example, which aligns strongly with our signature topics, as I've alluded to before, our data can track many indicators. For example, we can look at promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. The second column that you see in front of you, that is the targets of the indicators, it is a column that shows the relevant SDG indicator to which we make this contribution. These are the UN indicators to which Afrobarometer makes this contribution. And the third column on your right lists the indicators, Afrobarometer specific indicators that can help measure the progress towards the goals that are on our left. For example, in this case, goal number 16. So for SDG 1, on poverty, ending poverty, Afrobarometer has a well-established index that we call the Lived Poverty Index, LPI. It is a useful indicator that documents the experience of ordinary people with respect to a number of issues that we'll talk about. And it's a component measure of the frequency of going without food, relates directly to SDG number 2, ending hunger and malnutrition. To track progress, therefore, towards good health, well-being of all, which is SDG number 3, we have data on how often people go without the needed health care, how easy or difficult they find it to go to get well health care, and how often they had to pay a bribe and so on to be able to access that health care. So from the many indicators that we have for each SDG, we have only selected just a few, probably 1 or 2 indicators that best capture or best speaks to the key objectives of the SDG. Like I've indicated, Afrobarometer has several indicators, but we've only selected a few that we think would satisfactorily provide or speak to the relevant SDGs that we are discussing. And these are what we use to construct our SDG scorecard, the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards. So I will now walk you through a selection of the country scorecards. Please allow me to note at this point that the East African region has Afrobarometer countries. East African region has slightly about 8 to 10 countries. What we are sharing with you here is a select scorecards from 5 or 6 countries. And this is what we are going to discuss. But we also need to understand that there are many other countries, like has been indicated by Salome earlier, that we have information, Afrobarometer has information about, on which we can actually undertake this particular analysis. So we present the scorecard in 3 formats. The first format is a detailed indicator that shows over time trends within the country. In other words, when we're in a particular country, we are all able to see how have the indicators behaved over a given period of, say, 5 years in a particular country. But we also have a summary page for each country using what we are calling the stoplights that I will talk to shortly. That particular summary gives us an indication of, in one page, all the SDGs, the scorecards for a particular country in a singular page. And finally, Afrobarometer also has a continental summary that gives, for example, a particular SDG like ending hunger and how all the countries perform under that particular SDG. Please allow me to also note that, as I've indicated and emphasized, some of these we are sharing here are only select results that we are sharing with you. But much of this information is available, and if it's of interest, we can visit the Afrobarometer website, www.afrobarometer.org, as well as visit the respective country pages on that very website. All this information will be available there. So I will start by talking briefly about Kenya. So what you have in front of us is SDG number 1 for ending poverty, no poverty. On the screen, on the top left corner, we have the proportion of Kenyans experiencing moderate or high-lived poverty. This is the index that we talked about. How frequently ordinary Kenyans, in this case, go without, food and all these essentials that make up this particular index. We notice that the proportion of Kenyans experiencing moderate to high-lived poverty has bounced back to about 52 after a drastic improvement in 2014. So in the year 2014, we had as low as about 38% of people who were experiencing moderate to high lived poverty. As of 2019, when Kenya did the last round 8 survey, that number of people had significantly moved up to 52, more than half the population. For SDG 2, where we talk about zero hunger, the proportion who say they went without enough food, many times or always in the past years, have doubled as well since 2014. So you can see that in 2014, that number was about 7%. When we did the last survey in 2019, that number had drastically risen to 14%. SDG on education, where we try to measure access to secondary or higher education. Since 2014, the proportion of men, as you can see, with secondary or higher education has remained roughly the same. But it's critical that the proportion of educated women has actually increased, which is a plus in this case. But we also need to reiterate that even with that improvement, the gender gap in education has actually narrowed, meaning that increment in the number of educated women has actually served to impact on the gender gap between men and women in Kenya. Please let me talk briefly also about Malawi. Malawi, looking at SDG number 5, what you will notice here is that we have select countries, and for each select country, we are looking at select SDGs. In other words, now we talk about gender equality in Malawi, but we talked about education, ending poverty and hunger in Kenya. What we are doing in this scorecards is to share select SDGs on select countries, but the entire data set for each particular country is available on the website as I indicated. So on Malawi, SDG number 5 on gender equality, the use of mobile phones and the internet among men and women has continuously increased since the year 2008. But the gender gaps in use of both mobile phones and the internet has increased, meaning that women are falling further behind. With regards to financial decision-making power within the household, what we find in Malawi is that the proportions of women who say they make financial decisions themselves or with their spouses have actually decreased. Let's have a brief on Tanzania. In Tanzania, we are going to look at SDG 6, that is access to clean water and sanitation. And what we find is that in Tanzania, the proportion who went without enough clean water, many times or always, look at the top left corner, during the previous year has changed from 19% to 16%, which ideally just about 3, it's just about our cutoff point, which we say is not statistically significant because the change is just about 3. When we have a change which is, as I'll discuss this later on, when we have a change which is more than 3, we notice that as a statistically significant, and therefore we can talk about a change, positive change have been made. If it goes on the negative side, that applies the same. But what we see here is just about 3 percentage points, which is just about statistically significant change. And the share who never went without enough clean water has clearly increased. As we'll see later on, the scorecards in the region, for example, the East African region, apparently Tanzania is among the countries that are doing fairly well. With respect to SDG number 7 on affordable and clean energy, Tanzania has also clearly made progress on providing reliable electricity. If you look at the bottom left of graph, although lack of access to electricity remains high. In other words, there has been improvement in terms of making it reliable, but the extent of access is still significantly low. Let me speak to SDG number 8 on decent work, still on Tanzania, and economic growth. If you look at that, compare that 2014, unemployment has increased for both men and women in Tanzania. But I need to reiterate that the gap between women and men has actually remained pretty much unchanged. So even though unemployment has increased, the difference between the men and women has actually remained largely unchanged, which is not very good. Let me talk briefly about Tanzania. And when we talk about Tanzania, I want to look at SDG number 10, where we talk about reduced inequalities, economic and ethnic inequality. If you look at the top left, graph on the top left, we find that in Uganda, the number of people who experience moderate to high-lived poverty that we talked about has actually increased by 17 percentage points since 2015, when the SDGs were adopted. But looking at the ethnic inequality, this is the top right graph, the proportion who say that members of their ethnic group are never treated unfairly by the government has tripled between 2008 and 2019. That is from 17% to 54%. In other words, this is the number of people who feel that they do not feel that the government is being unfair to them or to their groups. That number has increased significantly, which is good, speaking to SDG number 16. Now, Zambia. In Zambia, I want to look at SDG number 13, which is on climate change. We find that in Zambia, the awareness of climate change has remained unchanged, as you can see, about 54, 55 between 2017 and 2020. But what's interesting is that the understanding of the negative impact of climate change has increased dramatically. So even though awareness remains almost stagnated, but understanding the impact of what the negative impact of that climate, of what climate change is, many people have actually gained that understanding. And I think in Sudan, I also just mentioned briefly in Sudan that there has been a decline in trust in state institutions, especially in the police, the judiciary, and parliament, since the year 2015. And perceived corruption among members of parliament and the police in that country has also increased significantly. So these are just some examples of the trends in country where progress, we are going to assess progress and also assess if there has been progress or the country's actually been retreating. So the slides that are going to come next are slides that are going to help us assess the retreat or progress. And before I delve into the particular countries, I just want to provide the how we do the measurement, how this has been done. We are going to make this presentation in what we called earlier stoplights. These stoplights illustrate the changes, and these changes can actually be positive for progress or negative for a retreat. And our assessment of Afrobarometer has done this over about the past 5 years. When we did round 6, what we call our round 6 in the year 2014, 2015, to round 8 in the year 2019 and 2021. For climate action, that is SDG number 13, and bribes for public services, SDG number 16, where we don't have data for round 6. What we present to you actually looks at the changes which occurred between round 7 and round 8. That is the data collection in 2016, 2018, and 2019, 2020. Because we only have 2 data points for these particular ones, and we were not able to collect that kind of information on climate and bribery on public services when we conducted our surveys in the year 2014, 2015, when we were implementing round 6. So what about these top lines? The red that you see on top means the country's performance has worsened by more than 3 percentage points over this time span of 5 years. So this is what I talked about. If we not between the period that we are carrying out the assessment, if the change is more by 3 percentage points, which we think is statistically significant, then we say that change. If it's on the negative, we say that has been a retreat. A yellow means no change. In other words, the change that we realize lies between -3 and +3. So if we ever get a change in between there, we say that is not reasonable enough. It is not statistically significant. But when we get a green means we have obtained a change which is better, positive change, but which is also more than 3 percentage points. When we see a blue, it means that particular country is actually meeting that particular target. That particular country is actually meeting that particular SDG target. You also see at the bottom of the slide, we have some half circles. The half circles could be half green, could be half red. What it means is that it indicates that different levels of progress on different aspects of an indicator, such as, for example, if we have education, if we have improvement by men in education, but we might also end up having a retreat, the same retreat for women. It means then we have a particular outcome that gives us mixed results, better for men or for women, and the other one is converse. So that is where we end up having what we're calling the half circles. So let me just delve very quickly, and also in the interest of time, into Kenya so that we see how this is performing. So in Kenya, as indicated, is doing worse on reducing poverty and hunger. Look at SDG 1, poverty, SDG 2, hunger. Come down, good health. What we have there are red spotlights. And it means, therefore, that the country is also experiencing worsening unemployment, including a growing gender gap. You can see those buttons as you move towards down, those particular SDGs. In other words, this is the one page in which we have a country and we document all the SDGs and how it has performed. But the country is doing better on increasing access to corruption. That's where we have the half circles. In Malawi, Malawi has made progress only towards including poverty, hunger, unemployment, gender equality, financial control, climate action. All this, Malawi is actually doing very, very well. It shows mixed results on gender equality in technology use, access to clean water and sanitation, and trust in state institutions, including the police, the judiciary, and parliament. The country has actually made no progress on increasing access to education and electricity, or on even reducing ethnic inequalities and payment of bribes, which is really, really really, really problematic. So earlier on, I mentioned Tanzania. I alluded a discussion about Tanzania. Tanzania, as I indicated, is one of the few countries in the region that are making progress on reducing poverty and hunger. You can see the green, the green spotlights that we have. The country is also doing better on several other indicators, including ensuring access to medical care. You can see that from the chart, clean water and electricity, as well as reducing economic and ethnic inequalities. Trust in the police, judiciary, and parliament has also increased, while perceived corruption amongst these institutions has declined. That indeed is a positive signal that you can see from the list of the green spotlights for Tanzania. But we also see red spotlights. The country is actually slipping on climate action. Unemployment has worsened, and the gender gap in unemployment has remained unchanged. Tanzania has also made no progress in increasing access to education, ensuring gender equality, and reducing payment of bribes for public services. I'll go quickly and discuss Uganda. Uganda is doing worse on several indicators. You can clearly see, how many reds we have, practically on almost most of the SDGs. So it's doing worse in several of these indicators, including poverty, unemployment, medical care, education, and clean water. It is also doing worse on climate action, trust in institutions, and payment of bribes. But it has made progress on ensuring gender equality in financial control, increasing access to electricity, and reducing ethnic inequalities. Unemployment and gender gaps in unemployment and technology use have somehow remained stagnated, as you can see. Zambia is experiencing worsening poverty, hunger, and economic and ethnic inequalities, as the red spotlights show. Payment of bribes for public services and challenges relating to access to medical care, clean water, and electricity have also worsened for the country. If you look at unemployment, has remained stagnated, while the gender gap in unemployment has actually worsened. The country has also made no progress on ensuring gender equality, increasing awareness of climate change, and reducing perceived corruption among state institutions. But there has been mixed progress, as you can see from the scorecard. There has been mixed progress on access to education and infrastructure, as well as trust in state institutions. I'll just mention briefly about Sudan, which has quite a bit of the red spotlights as well. They have done fairly well on gender equality in financial control, and also reducing gender gap in unemployment. Those are aspects that Sudan has actually done well, but majority of the indicators really, as you can see from the scorecard, comprise the red spotlights, which is not really doing very well. So in conclusion, therefore, and I'm hoping, Salome, I'm hoping I haven't overrun my time. In conclusion, therefore, I really want to reiterate that the quick overview that I've provided of the SDG scorecards that we are releasing today, for the East African region, which is part of a larger launch for the Afrobarometer for the entire continent. There will be other, there have been other releases, but there are also other releases that are going to be, especially for our Southern African counterparts. And in total, we are going to release about scorecards for about 31 countries. And I have indicated earlier, this can actually be found on our website, but also on the individual country pages on our website, because all the countries that we cover in Africa, each of them has actually a distinct page for itself in our website. So in conclusion, therefore, the SDGs that we're talking about ultimately are intended as tools to improve the lives of people. And as I've said earlier, there are several indicators out there by governments, by civil society, by the UN themselves, that are being used to track this. What we are providing as Afrobarometer is a unique aspect that brings on board, that integrates into all this discussion, the perspectives, the experiences, the evaluations of the ordinary African. And this is critical if we are actually to provide a fair and satisfactory assessment in tracking the progress of these SDGs, because that particular aspect, that experience of the ordinary person, these are the people to whom SDGs have been designed to improve their lives. And therefore, considering how these assessments compare or contrast with other SDG indicators out there that I've alluded to, our expectation as Afrobarometer is that we can make a contribution through these scorecards in a way that stimulates debate, in a way that helps to identify gaps that are inherent, and also provide a support to action for moving these countries forward, not only for this particular region, but also for the entire continent. Thank you so much for listening to me, and we'll be here to respond to some of your concerns and questions. Asante sana, Salome.
Thank you so much, Abel, for the good presentation. And you have touched a lot of information that is very important, and every country know right now how the score is. So I would like to remind our participants that we have this session is going live on YouTube channel and also on Facebook. And also we have our social media account. Please tag any message. And our hashtag is hashtag voice, that's V is capital, Africa, Voices Africa, and also hash SDGs. So if you have any question, please, or any comment, please put it in our chat box, and then I will read during the question and answer. So I would like you to move on with our timetable. And now I would like to invite our panelists. As I introduced them earlier, right now I would like to introduce again our panelists for today, for those who are connected with us right now. Our panelists for today are Crystal Simeon, Director of NAWI AFEM Microeconomics Collective from Kenya. Also, we have Alkikags, co-founder and executive director of the Open Institute from Kenya also. And we have Aidani Eyakuze, executive director of Taweza from Tanzania. So I would like to welcome our panelists. And I would like to start by asking them a question, and all of them will ask this question. Which of the findings do you find most interesting on the presentation of Abel? I will start with Crystal. Welcome.
Thank you, Salome. It's really great to be here amongst some really great people. And thank you, Abel, for your presentation. It was really insightful. I had a pre-copy of the findings as well. And I must say, I think it's interesting that gender was analyzed specifically for the gender bit, but I was curious to see what it would be like to have a gender disaggregation along all the indicators. So like for access to healthcare, for example. But the most important for me was climate. And I think this was interesting because I think last week there was all of this talk on social media because Duke University produced this paper about how Africa's cooking on stoves is contributing so greatly, I say that in quotes, to climate change globally. Africa produces less than 3% of climate emissions. So I found that really interesting, and that some countries are really hitting their targets with regard to climate change. And I'm interested what Aidan has to say about this, because Tanzania, for example, is hitting targets with regard to poverty and healthcare, but with climate, not so much. But the countries that are hitting targets on climate are really not hitting targets on poverty. And I can't help but wonder if that has something to do with external funding. And who's funding what, I think is something I've been thinking about. And are we just, is Africa being used as a space to fight a climate justice battle when we're not the most responsible for it? But then as Abel was talking, it also reminds me of Amilcar Cabral's quote, and I've quoted this so many times, and he says, always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They're fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. And I think that struck me because in almost all countries, apart from Aidan's in Tanzania and Salome, we're really not seeing any targets hitting healthcare and poverty. And that's really, bread and butter stuff. And I'm curious to see the interconnection between dictatorship type governance and hitting those bread and butter issues versus the rest of us who are hitting very sometimes seeming, abstract issues around climate, especially on the continent, when issues around access to healthcare and poverty, for example, are still so far off. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I would like to pose also this question to Alkag. Please, which of the findings do you find most interesting in this presentation? Welcome, please.
Thank you so much. I want to say I found this report extremely interesting, especially looking at Kenya. I just found it to be very interesting on very many levels. I could identify with it because of the fact that indeed poverty, we're doing very badly on poverty. We're doing very badly on decent work. In Kenya, we have, at the Open Institute, we've had a project over the last 2 years where we have been looking at decent work. It was triggered by a young man who brought it to our attention that the people working in our industrial area are having to operate on an almost slave-like environment. They're working 18-hour days, standing for most of that time with 10-minute breaks. Anything longer than 10 minutes, you're docked. Some of them have been casual workers for a full 10 years. Therefore, with no, they're essentially permanent workers, just that they come every day and they hope that they will be taken by the same company every day. And they're taken by the same company every day for 10 years. And, the government is not doing anything about it, but worse still is that the trade unions are clearly complicit in that environment. But the thing that struck me the most as Abel was going through his presentation was the question of quality education, and that's a recent thing that has piqued my interest. As a result of COVID-19, the Open Institute decided to move to work from home and become entirely remote working. So all of us sort of dispersed out of the capital city, Nairobi. I moved to Malindi in Kilifi County at the coast. Some of my colleagues moved to different counties across the country. One of the things that we all have been struck by is the number of people who are actually being left behind. I think lately I've been telling a lot of stories about people who are, say 19, I have somebody specific who is in my mind right now, that I have two people that I've been talking about lately. One is called Benjamin, he is 19, he's 21, he's married to a 19-year-old young lady, and they have a 4-year-old child. Do the math. Another is Mama Furaha is, I think 40, 42. She doesn't know for sure, but she cannot write her name. These are actually human beings who are living in Kenya. Both of these people do not have ID cards. They're not registered by the country. So when I look at these data sets, I often I'm asking myself at the back of my mind, is that who is being missed out entirely by the statistics that we're producing? And how are we tracking those guys because of the fact that those guys are being left behind entirely? In the last 2 months, I think I have I have done hundreds of kilometers on the road between Kilifi County, Tana River County, going all the way to Lamu County. And all I've been doing is just going and meeting with women's groups that are doing, during the day that they're doing table banking or during market days, to just try and understand what it is that they're up to. I'm meeting with young men and women at the places where they're doing their jobs, just to learn from them and see what they're existing. Almost to a man, almost to a group, I'm finding that in our women's group, a table banking women's group of 25 people, I am finding 18 of them cannot read or write. Out of these 18, very many of them, maybe let's say 12, are below the age of 25. I went to a women group where there were 25 women. Only 3 women had less than 8 children. And those 3 women who had less than 8 children are the ones who are educated. And out of those 3 women, majority of them were in their 30s. So you're finding somebody who is 35 and has 8 children, has not gone to school, or dropped out of school at standard 3, but does not have an identity card, which means that whatever system of government is existing to support people who might be indigent, they don't exist. They don't have NHIF, which is our health system card. They don't have any support system, and the chief only peripherally knows them because of the fact that he sees them passing up and down the street. But he can't say that this is an actual Kenyan citizen. This is the actual challenge that I see that is going to be found when we're looking at the SDGs and when you're tracking the SDGs. I don't think it's going to be the data that is actually being found at our National Bureau of Statistics, or the data that we're able to collect directly, fairly easily from a statistical point. I think we have a statistical challenge to actually go and actually identify people who are invisible and they don't go into the chief's barazas, they can't be found in groups, and they generally do not participate in anything from a citizen engagement standpoint. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Al. I would like to pose the same question to Aidan Yakuze, Executive Director of Twaweza from Tanzania. Which of the findings do you find most interesting? Welcome, Aidan.
Thank you very much, Salome. It's great to see you, Crystal and Al and Abel. Thank you for a great presentation. I hope you can all hear me. Crystal and Al really put some important challenges in front of us. Maybe we can come back to them later. But I wanted to really appreciate this report because I think it's really brilliant to see this summary of citizens' own assessment, own report card on their country's performance on delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. And this collection, this aggregation, this dissemination of citizen-generated data is really critical to understanding and addressing the challenges facing our countries. And I really want to emphasize that because I think, my understanding, as Abel was mentioning, is that these are surveys of ordinary citizens' lived realities, lived poverty, lived access to public services, etc. So for me, I find this a very rich set of information in that it really provides how people are experiencing their daily lives along these various SDGs, rather than it being a statistical exercise of measuring how many people are actually accessing those services, or sort of some of the measures of poverty, for example, can be quite interesting in that they may not capture how people feel about how poor or how well they are, but they capture something about a basket of goods that they're consuming and the price of that basket of goods. It's a very statistical, very economic exercise, which is, I think, what Al was pointing out to as being an exercise that can miss out a lot of people, number one, and they can actually miss out sort of the color, the reality of what they're purportedly trying to capture. But I think we can come into that a little bit later. What I found really surprising was actually Tanzania's red, green, and orange dots table. There's a large number of green dots. 55% I counted. 11 out of the 20 dots are green or half green. So this signals citizens perceiving quite a bit of improvement compared to other countries where, you know, we saw the Malawi, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, and most of them are red, perhaps denoting more pessimism and a sense of deterioration that probably reflects the real reality. But here's a question I've been asking myself since I looked at them. And that is, I wonder whether in Tanzania, it could be, well, let me put it this way, whether it's a function of different initial expectations of citizens about what their government can deliver. Perhaps are Tanzanians really expecting far less from their government and being grateful for what they get, while others, maybe in Kenya or Uganda, expect more, and what they get, they're not happy with, or they're seeing that this is not enough, we're deteriorating, hence you get lots of flashes of red in those other countries and flashes of green in Tanzania. I'm not suggesting that this is the only explanation, but I think that could have something worth thinking about. What is our level of expectation as citizens of our governments along all of these lines? And then when we measure what we really see as progress, it could be an indicator of how we think the government is doing based on what we expect them to do. But I think when I looked again closely at the Tanzania scorecard, our own surveys, we do surveys which are similar to Afrobarometer, but in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, our own surveys really corroborate what we're seeing here, especially on the issue of unemployment, where in our own surveys between 2018 and 2020, unemployment went up from 7th in the priority position, number 4 to number 2. And prior to that, in 2015, it was actually number 7 in the priority list of the problems facing the country. So I think this corroborates that element. But on the other side, we're noticing that public service improvement in the Afrobarometer survey is somewhat mirrored by the sense in our own surveys that these are no longer a priority problem to be dealt with. Health, water, even education. And I think this has something to do with the fact that in the past 4 or 5 years, a lot of health centers were built. The challenge, of course, is staffing them and equipping them, but a lot of health centers were built. And you know, when people see a building, bright, shiny new building, they probably think, well, you know, we're doing well here. We know this health problem, the lack of access to health is going to be dealt with. And so that falls down the priority list. Similarly, in 2016, the government instituted a fee-free primary and secondary education. So again, there people felt, I don't have to be out of pocket to send my kids to school, which means therefore that I have better access to education. Issues of quality are another matter, but the fact that you can actually deliver on a fee-free education probably helps a lot. But where the challenge lies is in the economy, jobs, food security. That is where I think most Tanzanians are feeling perhaps things ought to be improving. So to Crystal's question, climate change being one of the problems or one of the areas where Tanzania has not done well. You know, in many African countries, people still cook using, you know, as you mentioned, wood stoves. And that I think is, or charcoal stoves. And that is going to have an impact on our forest cover. As populations grow, as more of us need to eat cooked food, we're going to be cutting down probably more trees in order to cook that food. And we might then begin to see what they're showing in Zambia, the effect, or Malawi, the effect of climate change becoming much more localized and domesticated there, or at least localized effects of less tree cover, which has impact on water availability, access, even the microclimate that is in that area. But your point about whether this is will be used as a battleground for climate justice, I think it's a really, really good point, where those of us who are living, our compatriots who are living literally on the margins, are having to bear the brunt of the blame for climate change. I think really feels a bit rich, feels a bit unfair. So I think this is something we're going to have to change the narrative about, or deal with head on, as we try to bring forward, bring forward the prosperity people in SDGs. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aidan. Yesterday, 12th July, yesterday, I'm talking about yesterday, was the African Anti-Corruption Day. But the Afrobarometer SDG scorecards we have just seen show that most of the countries are not doing too well on trust and the perceiving corruption in institutions, as well as a payment of bribes for public services. Only in Tanzania showing the progress. What are your comments, Crystal? Please, welcome.
I really shy away from talking about corruption. And I think there's power in language and narrative. When I spoke last, I spoke about bread and butter, and somebody in the audience who's a friend and colleague was, did a red flag. And it's true, bread and butter is elitist. Like, how many Kenyans or East Africans actually eat butter or bread to that end? And so I think that the process of unlearning the things that are so colonial in the way that we exist and occupy space and the world is important. And one of those things is corruption. In a global context, if you look at illicit financial flows leaving the continent, about $100 billion every year. 65% of that is lost through illicit financial flows. Only 5% is lost through corruption. And so when I stand back, I can see the magnitude of an inequality that is really having a huge impact on the everyday lives of Africans, of East Africans, of Kenyans. In my case, I live in Nairobi. However, two things can exist at the same time. As Twitter says, you can walk and chew gum. And so, yes, there's this huge global inequality. Within it, there's such a huge corruption issue, and huge, I mean, because we're living it every day. It's in our faces. On Friday, I went with my mom to Nyeri, where she comes from in rural Kenya. And on the way back on Thika Road, there are these policemen who literally were flailing their arms on the road on the highway, stopping every third car, accusing you of overspeeding. Now, we knew we weren't overspeeding. We were driving at 70 kilometers in an 80-kilometer zone. And they were like, no, you were overspeeding. They have no evidence, but a notebook where they seem to have gotten, your overspeeding license plate from their colleague up the road. And they were demanding 20,000 shillings every third car. And they were going crazy. It was like they were having a party. They could have been dancing on a roadshow. They were so excited. And so I tweeted, and I copied the ombudsman, the IG of police. It got retweeted a number of times, but also what was interesting was that so many people corroborated the story, saying that they've been stopped at that same exact spot and naming other spots in the country where this is happening. And there's nothing you can do about it, right? Like, you can go to the ombudsman, which I've tried to, not just this time, but before. Nothing really happens. And as a citizen, you don't have any power whatsoever. So I wonder about, what justice means here in very close quarters, when on one hand, because of corruption levels being so high, you know that you can get away with most things. But on the other hand, there's an almost, you must always pay to be able to access anything. And so it's a very private solution for very public problems. To be able to get a vaccine, I know people who've had to pay a bribe of 6,000 shillings to access a government vaccine in a country that has banned private vaccinations, right? To be able to get anything, I mean, my landlord banned riders from coming in, but unofficially told us, you can pay the watchman, but if we catch him, he will be fired. So it's permeated every single part of our lives and the way we exist and how we operate in the world, to the point I'm not so sure we would know how to operate in a space where it's not corrupt. But on the other hand, when I spoke about the power of narratives and words, when we talk about illicit financial flows, when we talk about the unfair trade policies that govern global trade, for example, in a sense it is corruption, in a sense it is theft. But somehow, corruption is placed on the global south, on African countries, and that's sort of an overarching excuse of, this is why you're not doing well, is because you're so corrupt, without complicating the issue with what it means for us to exist in a global space where injustice and inequality has been rampant for so long. The slave trade contributed about $60 trillion into a global north economy from free labor, right? That's theft of us and of our time and of our expertise. And nobody talks about that. And that perpetuates and continues to create divisions in the globe in the way that we see it. So when you look at the global corruption index, and all the countries in red are in the south. But if you look at the transparency index on, safe tax havens, for example, all those countries are in the north, but they're not regarded as corrupt. They're not regarded as, corrupt countries, but they are. And so I think we have to question the power of the words that we use, the narratives that we use, and I open up for some help in unlearning bread and butter and finding our own African terminology for that. But yeah, that's my very complex feelings about corruption and how to go about it. On one hand, I would, like, in a global fight, it's hard to keep perpetuating this conversation of corruption. But on the other hand, when I come back home and I get stopped by the cops, and it's this permanent, constant haranguing of the state on citizens, it's hard to exist and to defend us from a Pan-African perspective.
Thank you so much, Crystal. The same question I would like to pose it to Ali. What do you think contributed to this worry trend, and what can be done to resolve this? Ali, please.
So I'm very much like Crystal, that I have become wary about talking about corruption, in part because of the fact that it's become one of those buzzwords that we have become so jaded that they've stopped meaning something. I don't know if that makes sense to everybody. It's something that we say. It's something that people on the streets in Kenya say all the time, to the extent that sometimes it stops meaning. It starts having meaning, and which sometimes is part of the reason why maybe it continues, because of the fact that it's become a part of our lives. In 2002, Kenya is said to have gone through something called the second liberation, where our second president, Moi, finally left 24 years in office. A lot of the people who had been agitating for his exit and agitating for a better system became ministers in the next government, the Kibaki government. And they actually came from civil society, and they were among the strongest agitators for, against corruption. What is interesting is that a bunch of them, at least half of them, were eventually mentioned or adversely found to have participated in even more significant corruption than the corruption that had happened during the dictator's time. What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that there's a thing about corruption that has caused us to be so blasé about it that I don't like to talk about it. What I do like to talk about instead is citizens. Even myself, let me use myself as an example. if given the chance, I will take the money and use it in whichever way that I please, because of the fact that nobody is looking. But if citizens are active and they are paying attention, then it becomes more difficult for me to grab money and use it to buy myself a Mercedes Benz. But we must find ways to empower our citizens to participate, to watch, to speak out, to tweet as Crystal has done, and as we continue to do in private and public settings. We have to find a way to get citizens to believe enough in themselves and in their power. Now, getting them to believe in their power means that you have to provide them with something called functional literacy. And functional literacy is, in my view, basic literacy plus financial inclusion, plus civic education, plus hope. A lot of times we have programs in civil society that deal with these three things: with civil, basic education, there are literacy organizations. With financial inclusion, there are organizations that are doing this. Civic education, there's organizations and funding, lots of funding for this. But hope. The hope that if I spoke out against corruption, then something will happen. Then something could happen. If enough of us spoke, then something could happen. The hope that if we work together as a collective, then our lives could change. That is something that is harder to inject, but is one of the things that I have been arguing lately is needed if we are to achieve the SDGs at the clip that we want to achieve. And just to note here that I think that we're in actual danger of not, in fact, achieving the SDGs by 2030.
Thank you so much, Ali. Our time is running fast and we have a lot of questions. Aidan, only Tanzania is showing progress in trust and corruption, but even there, changed. What do you think contribute to this worry trend, and what can be done to resolve this? Welcome, Aidan.
Sorry, I was on mute for a few seconds.
Welcome.
I was on mute for a few seconds there. Yeah, Tanzania looks really good in this report. Huh? Like I said, we need to dig a little bit below the surface here on the question of expectations. Look, we've just had this survey. I think when I look at it, it was a survey done towards the end of the Kikwete regime and probably somewhere in the middle of the Magufuli regime. Remember that hashtag, what would Magufuli do? You know, that had a long shelf life. And the very aggressive public fight against corruption, some of it fictitious corruption, I would argue, it has left a lot of people feeling that, you know, the grand corruption is no longer an issue. And yet small bribes, as the report shows, people are still paying those small things to get things done or to stop being harassed. You know, we had a period where the big headline was TRA, our revenue authority, was collecting loads and loads and loads of taxes. But what was less in the news, and Salome, you know this being a reporter, was the truth about how aggressive that tax collection strategy was. People suffered, people lost their businesses, people lost assets, people lost their wealth in the name of collecting taxes for the government of Tanzania. So I think trying to avoid that fate meant that people had to part with something in there. So that's why I think the bribery issue remains a bit problematic, at least in the impression of Tanzanians. What can be done about it? So let me put a bit of a plug here for the Open Government Partnership where I'm involved. And there are a number of, anti-corruption is one of the major pillars that we are trying to incentivize and encourage governments to include in their action plans to make government more transparent, more inclusive, and more accountable. So the accountability is about anti-corruption. And a couple of things, I know in Kenya, Nigeria, even Tanzania, South Africa have got this thing called a beneficial ownership transparency legislation. In other words, when you register a company in these countries, you have to write down the list of human beings who are going to be benefiting from the profits and the proceeds of the company. So hopefully, this might begin to address the issue of illicit financial flows going from country to country or from company outside of the country. At least we'll know whose bank accounts they land in, and therefore are able to track, follow, name, and shame, if that's what we can do as civil society. Secondly, it's what Al was mentioning, and I completely agree with him. Apart from the hope bit, hope is so, it's like, what do they call it? It's like steam. It's very hard to wrap your hands around. But literacy, functional literacy, financial literacy, what was the third thing? I've forgotten what you're mentioning, Al, there. But people having information is absolutely important for them to be able to individually fight against corruption. Even in grand corruption, I'll give you an example of a program in Kaduna called the Eyes and Ears program, where people have been allowed, invited, encouraged to take photographs of the public works in that state of Kaduna in Nigeria, where the government says we're going to build a school or a hospital or a road. Please help us monitor them. So you be our eyes and ears. And people would actually take photographs and send them and say, you said you're building this for X amount of money. Look what has happened, or look what is not happening. And so therefore they are able to follow up on that. So again, getting people engaged in actually monitoring the government in very practical terms helps in fighting against corruption. So, and there are others. So one is a big legislation piece. The other is actually allowing, empowering, people to monitor in very practical terms what the government is doing on their behalf. The third one, this is to you, Salome. We need a free press. We need investigative journalism that has got teeth. We need journalists who are supported. We need whistleblower legislation that really actually does protect whistleblowers, like they have in Liberia. These kinds of things are very important, that people will feel safe to be able to highlight corrupt practices and therefore hopefully reduce. And finally, we need corrupt people to be caught, prosecuted, convicted, and jailed. There's too little of that happening, So again, that's a systemic thing, but the more public pressure there is driven, the more people are able to monitor even the petty corruption. Take photos, Crystal, of those, the numbers, the traffic cops numbers over here. Take a photo and say, this guy asked for 20,000 from me when I wasn't speeding, and name and shame them. I think it could help. We've got to be much more active. We've got to make our own hope for ourselves.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with you that the media should do its work to make sure that this information are well known to our community, our people. Crystal Simeon, Director of FUNAWI, AfriFem Microeconomics Collective. Briefly, you have been championing gender and micro level equalities for about a decade now. But the Afrobarometer SDGs scorecards that have just been presented show persistence gender gaps, or at best mixed progress in most of the countries when it comes to gender equality in technology use, financial control, and employment. For your experience, what are some of the barriers to gender equality in Africa? Can you give a country-specific example? Welcome.
Thanks, Salome. So I know the organization is a mouthful. You can just call it the NAWI Collective. So we work on not just gender, but specifically feminist analysis of macro level economic policies and policy processes as well. This is because on the continent, when you listen to narratives around women or women's rights and the economy, it will usually be at a micro level. Financial inclusion, microcredit, all of those things that many a time are important, yes, but relegate women's lives to be only around the micro, that they should lead micro lives. But there's a huge impact on the lives and quality of life of women on the continent permeated from macro level economic policy making. And so this has to do with issues around debt, around tax. They're more systemic, less individual, more focused on the actual system. And that's where we think that change will begin to come from. There needs to be a lot more work done in that space, especially by ourselves, by African feminists. There's a difference between just gender or women's rights work and a feminist approach to these. We're guided by the African feminist principles, which you can find online. And that's what we use to do an analysis, or the lens that we see macro level interventions and economic policy. So that's just, you know, off the cuff, but it's also partly why we have not seen any real traction or progression with regard to women's rights on the continent. When COVID happened, Kenya, where I live, had all these, you know, special committees meeting with regard to COVID responses. Now, the gender departments in the government are so poorly funded that they have so few people that staff these departments, which means there wasn't enough women's rights experts to go around to all these committees, which means response was almost always didn't have a feminist or women's rights angle embedded into it. And so you will see rising rates of GBV, for example, with the lockdowns. What it meant was that women were locked in with the perpetrators. It doesn't mean to say that it increased because, you know, men were more, you know, anxious about what was going on. It's just that they were enclosed in the same spaces. And without lockdowns, women are able to get away from these spaces. But without somebody who works on gender, women's rights, or a feminist analysis of issues, then that intervention, you know, is rolled out without a gender thinking or lens applied to it. And so without looking at the systemic and looking always at individual targets or interventions rather, and always looking at how to remedy an issue when it's already has happened, I think is part of the problem, is why targets are not being met from a gender perspective. But also I think, you know, and I brought this up in the beginning, was that we tend to look at issues to do with women's rights as secondary, as a footnote, as a standalone many a time. The work of women's rights or gender equality, if you will, or a feminist approach to these issues permeates all areas of life, from access to healthcare, to access of education, poverty levels, all of it has a gender angle to it. And I think it's imperative that we make sure that that analysis runs through everything. And I challenge Afrobarometer to ensure that they do that in their analysis going forward as well, because that begins to help. A gender analysis isn't just, you know, male, women, men and women, you know, disaggregation of that. It needs to go deeper to be able to tell a story of economic quintile, for example, geography. Where do people live? Are women in some geographical areas more susceptible to some things than in other geographical areas? At economic quintile, what does life look at there? But what I do like about Afrobarometer is that it tells the narratives and stories of actual lived experiences, and that's what we need more to, you know, influence policies, where our lives are not always percentages. They're actual stories and narratives and lived experiences of what it feels like, is like to exist as an African citizen, as a Kenyan woman, for example. And I think that matters quite a lot. So I push back a little bit in terms of even these frameworks that we look at when we're in the space of unlearning and decolonizing the work that we do. We have our own Agenda 2063 with African Union, but all this money is poured into the SDG process. And many a times frameworks that are created by us are more progressive and are more fit to our experiences. And I wonder if we, you know, where's the space to make sure that we do look at Agenda 2063 alongside the SDG process as well? What does that look like? The Maputo Declaration on Women, for example, is way more progressive than the Global CEDAW, for example. And so what does it mean to look at our own frameworks and redefine questions and areas of analysis for ourselves, rather than it always being, you know, started off from the Global South and we're always left to respond. I question who sets the questions for research, who sets the questions for analyzing progress. When if it's not set by us, then it has a nuance that's a little bit different from our own experiences. And that also feeds into the question of gender. And African women's rights issue is somewhat different to a global one just because of our nuance, our historical context can be so different.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I would like to pose a question to Ali, co-founder and the executive director for the Open Institute. Let's talk about, just brief, because our time is running faster. Let's talk about the Open Institute's work on the SDG. You have recently published a document on the 6 big lessons you have learned during your work on SDG. Can you share some of these lessons with us? Link this to the relevance to the Afrobarometer SDG scorecard in improving citizens' perspective on the SDGs. Welcome, Ali.
Yeah, so we have gone through a time where we have been very interested in how the SDGs can be accomplished. And there's a couple of things that we've learned, and because of time, I'm only going to speak to one overarching lesson, which is that the SDGs can best be achieved by the citizens at the level citizens care about. So the argument that we make and the thing that we learn is that many citizens either don't have the capacity or don't want to have the capacity or don't care or don't know about what happens at national level. It tends to be very abstract and it tends to be very general. But when you're talking about things that are happening with their community, they can identify and they can understand what is happening. An example that I can give that we learned from around the time that we were doing or getting this lesson was that we met with somebody who told us, I've never touched $1 million shillings. So if $1 million Kenyan shillings. So if you tell me that you lost $1 billion shillings, it really means nothing to me. I can't compute it. It makes no sense. If you tell me that you are building a road from here to there and the price of the road is 10 billion per kilometer, again, it means nothing to me because of the fact that, I don't know. But if you tell me that within my community, you build public toilets, pit latrines at 4 million shillings per toilet, which is about $40,000 per toilet, then there I'll have a question because of the fact that I've done my own pit latrine at my house and I know I spent 40,000 shillings. So I will want to know how yours, costs so much more money. It has to be relatable. And therefore, the big task for us who operate at this level is to find ways to disaggregate data, to disaggregate the policy level conversation so that it comes down to places where citizens can connect with it. And I'm not even talking about these citizens who are being left behind. I'm talking about even educated citizens in Nyeri, in Dodoma, in places who themselves have an interest in figuring out how their community can be better. So if you want to make communities better, instead of aggregating and trying to solve the big problem at the national level, let's go and solve the problem village by village, county by county, or district by district. What that will do is that it will solve the problem entirely, and it will use the energy of many more people rather than relying on just the few people that we have elected into office. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Ali. My question goes to Aidan Eyakuze, Executive Director of Twaweza. You are an economist who is also passionate about access to education and other public services, as well as a responsible and accountable governance. The Afrobarometer country scorecard that we just presented show that the government's efforts in ensuring access to education and medical care and reducing poverty and the hunger are not yield satisfactory result in most of the countries, which expectation of Tanzania. Does this reflect the situation in the East Africa country you work in? What do you think are the main factors contributing to these challenges and what should be done about them? 3 questions. just briefly because of the interest of time. Welcome, Mr. Aidan.
I think there's one force we forget about on the African continent, and this is a hugely debatable, and that is the demographic momentum. We are in Tanzania producing 2 million brand new Tanzanians every single year. I think we are overwhelming the ability of government to deliver good quality schools, enough teachers, medicines, healthcare, hospitals, etc., to accommodate at the level of expectation of those numbers. So this demographic momentum is a huge. It is really going to be affecting the quality of all of our lives in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. I was just talking to some parliamentarians here, and we asked them a question: how many Tanzanians did you think, what's the population of Tanzania going to be in 2050? Many of them thought it was going to be about 75 million. The projection by the UN is 130 million. So that's double the expectation, the 130 million Tanzanians by the year 2050. To get good quality primary, secondary schools to them, hospitals, roads, etc., is an expensive exercise. So we need to recalibrate the way we finance and fund public services. We need to really think deeply about our own budgetary priorities, or we need to go back and say, hey, people, maybe we need to produce fewer children. It's a very unpopular thing to say, but at the same time, there are real consequences of having a large population with a very small resource base for the government to be able to provide for it. I think that's why in many countries it's doing that. And to answer for Tanzania, why is Tanzania an exception? Because they were very public, a lot of stories and told by the government, the previous government, of how much we spent on hospitals and how people are getting fee-free education. Drummed enough times into our heads, we believe this is a good thing. They're delivering on public services, and so we think they're doing a good job. Let us never underestimate or undermine the propaganda that government with a bully pulpit can do. They can make us believe that. And then you go to the school and the hospital, and it's not what you expected, and somehow you begin to say, I don't know what's wrong here, but the government told me that they built this, they brought this. How come I'm not feeling the real effect, the impact of this? Maybe I'm not grateful enough, maybe. And so we begin to question ourselves. But the lived reality is really quite different.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aidan. My last question is going to Abel Oyuke, Afrobarometer Project Manager for East Africa. If the governments and international organizations already collect lots of data on the economy, the health sector, employment, and so on, why do we need this additional Afrobarometer data about how ordinary people see things? Welcome, please.
Thanks, Salome. I think your question speaks to much of what I discussed earlier. Really, the data that we produce, the information that we generate, essentially is not meant to replace that which is already out there. No. As I said, what we seek to do is to provide this additional perspective that in many cases has been missing in some of the data sources that AI talked about, KNBS and the rest of these other institutions. We are trying to bring this new perspective, this additional perspective that brings on board, the evaluations, the opinions of the ordinary people, so that what the data that we get can actually be compared and contrasted with that which is already out there. So we are not seeking to replace what is out there. We are only seeking to provide this perspective to help bridge the gaps, provide a platform on which the countries can make decisions that are moving forward. I just want to also add very briefly as we conclude that, our data, the Afrobarometer data for us we think it's very critical, it's very fundamental to this process because we collect it on a frequent basis. After every 2 or 3 years, we go in each and every country to collect that data. And we have a very steadfast, a very stringent protocol as Afrobarometer that we apply in the collection of this data. We ensure that there is independence, we ensure that there's reliability, we ensure that the quality standards are maintained. And therefore we think with all these pillars, with all these tenets, it would be great to have this information, help us assess, or provide some sort of grounding for all the other indicators that are out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abel. Because of time, the time is not with us. I would like to thank all the panelists and our participants. I know some of them, they've just dropped their questions on chat box, but we will try as much as we can to answer them. And I know my panelists will answer these questions. And I would like to announce the dates of upcoming regional webinar like this on the SDG scorecards will be on Southern Africa on 31st August. So our participants, you are all welcome. And I would like to say thank you so much for our participants, especially to our panelists for this fruitful discussion that we had. And I'm wishing you a good day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.